opening the center immediately, a dynamic choice that invites confrontation and opens diagonals for early piece activity. Instantly seizing control of central squares, Black prepares to outmaneuver White's forces. Commanding the center and preparing rapid development, this knight skillfully avoids premature commitment, preserving flexibility against the Sicilian defense. Paving the way for a pawn to challenge White's central grip, this move fortifies Black's defenses and hints at potential counterplay. A probing check that disrupts Black's development and aims to exchange pieces, potentially easing White's pressure. The bishop retreats, maintaining the pawn chain's integrity while preparing for future development. Trading bishops here clarifies the pawn's structure and offers a clear path for piece development, simplifying the early middle game. Reclaiming the knight reestablishes pawn balance, but it opens a path for White's queen toward Black's queenside. Securing the king into safety allows White to focus on developing attacking potential. Developing a knight to a central square, this knight now eyes the d5 outpost and supports its own queenside expansion. Unifying the rooks and preparing to press on the kingside. Solidifying the pawn chain, Black prepares to develop the kingside pieces and challenge White's central control. This prepares to expand the queenside, potentially opening a path for the pawn or supporting future queenside pawn advances for queenside space. Solidifying the kingside castling is now a priority, preparing to connect the rooks and activate the queen. Preparing to anchor the bishop on a more robust diagonal, setting up potential queenside pressure. Securing the monarch through castling establishes a fundamental defensive structure, preparing for central development and potential pawn breaks later in the game. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure, this advance simultaneously challenges Black's central control and prepares a potential kingside attack by opening lines. Bringing the rook to the center of the board offers potential for future central pawn advances and supports the knight's development. Shifting the king from the active diagonal avoids potential discovery threats and prepares for future pawn pushes. Expanding on the queenside offers a potential avenue for counterplay, although it might weaken the pawn structure. Opens the center to activate pieces and potentially launch an attack, but demands careful calculation to avoid being overrun. Restricting your bishop's mobility, this retreat concedes valuable central influence and opens lines for White's queenside expansion. Initiating knight development to control central squares and prepare for further pawn advances. Preparing to shift the queen's focus to the kingside, potentially eyeing a central pawn break or supporting a flank initiative. Reinforcing the d-file prepares for potential central breakthroughs and increased pressure. Unleashing queenside pressure, this pawn thrust challenges White's central control and opens avenues for counterplay. Liberating the d-file opens avenues for coordinated piece play and pressure on Black's queenside pawn structure. Reclaiming the pawn initiates a dynamic central struggle, aiming to disrupt White's pawn structure and gain active piece play. Expanding on the queenside now, White aims to seize space and constrain Black's developing pieces. A strategic regrouping, the knight repositions to a potentially more active square, eyeing the queenside advancement while defending a central pawn. Liberating the c-file opens lines for your rooks and puts pressure on Black's queenside pawns. Recapturing opens the file for aggressive pawn play and reestablishes material balance, albeit with a slightly less active bishop. This pawn advance aims to secure a crucial outpost on b4 and potentially restrict Black's queenside expansion, though it concedes a slight outpost on c4 for the opponent. Controlling the open c-file now becomes paramount, preventing White's rooks from establishing dominance. Securing the knight's central influence, this redeployment prepares for a d4-d5 pawn push, aiming to crack open the queenside and liberate White's pieces. This knight ventures towards the center, aiming to challenge White's queenside pawns and potentially support an e-pawn push. Unveiling the queenside majority, this capture ignites a pawn storm and opens critical diagonals. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position, allowing black to solidify their pawn structure and prepare for middle game skirmishes with their knights. Recapturing the pawn with the knight opens lines, but black's queenside pawns gain crucial mobility. Rook penetrates to the second rank, seizing an open file and pressuring the b-pawn, disrupting white's queenside structure. Simplifying the material opens a path for your knight, aiming for central influence and a cleaner pawn structure. Regaining the pawn creates a more balanced pawn structure, but white's knight now enjoys a strong outpost. Solidifying the e4 pawn while preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm. Instantly challenging the knight on b5 forces a decision and aims to disrupt white's queenside structure. Introducing a new attacking avenue, this pawn push bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to unravel black's defenses and gain crucial space. Asserting control of the open file becomes paramount with this assertive advance, aiming to challenge white's pawn structure. Exploiting open files, this advance pushes black's rook back, gaining crucial space and preparing a queenside breakthrough. Sacrificing the bishop opens the file for your rook to attack the isolated pawn, creating dynamic counterplay. Controlling the c-file with the knight opens up possibilities for piece activity and could lead to queenside pressure. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside aims to disrupt white's solid formation and create attacking chances. Asserting control over the crucial c-file now becomes paramount for white's initiative. Seeking to activate the rook on the open file, though perhaps neglecting its defensive duties along the second rank for a moment. This rook repositioning aims to contest the critical open file, preparing to exploit any weaknesses along the second rank. Trading down here simplifies the position and aims to exploit the isolated pawn structure. Reclaiming the open file simplifies the position and prepares to contest the remaining central tension. Repositioning the knight towards the center creates potential endgame advantages by threatening central squares and preparing for pawn advances. Reclaiming the open file offers attacking prospects and frees up your knight for better placement. Seizing the open b file, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay. Seeking active counterplay, white probes the kingside flank, aiming to exploit the isolated pawns. Suddenly, black tries to disrupt white's queenside control by targeting the vulnerable a3 pawn. Sacrificing the rook to force the king out of its fortress. Forced, of course, but surrendering the open file is a significant positional concession. Seizing the 8th rank, white simplifies into a winning endgame by isolating the knight. Reclaiming the center with the knight offers a slight reprieve, though the isolated pawns remain a persistent weakness. Securing the monarch against any lingering threats on the queenside initiates the endgame phase. Shifting the king to the back rank prepares for the looming endgame exchanges. King's safety is paramount now, repositioning the monarch to a more secure square. Consolidating the king's safety is paramount now that many pieces have been exchanged. The king's journey to safety begins, aiming for a more secure central position away from the enemy rook. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure addresses potential weaknesses and prepares for a more stable defensive setup. Instilling a knight into the enemy camp on b6 presents a positional stranglehold, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create endgame advantages. Relocating the king to the center offers centralizing possibilities and prepares for potential pawn advances. Initiating the king's central ascent is paramount to consolidate forces and prepare for the upcoming struggle. Bringing the monarch closer to the fray offers central control and potential for coordinated action. Centering the king solidifies its position and prepares for pawn advancements, initiating a gradual tightening of white's grip. Centering the king on the queen's side opens up avenues for the monarch to participate more actively in the unfolding endgame skirmishes. Activating the knight on c8 directly threatens to infiltrate black's camp, forcing immediate defensive adjustments. Securing the king's safety after the material exchange is paramount, allowing for future maneuverability. The knight returns to a more active square, preparing to contest the queenside pawns or support a central advance. Fortifying the king's safety by tucking it behind the knight's pawn is a sound defensive posture. Shifting the knight to the edge opens the door for the king's centralize while preparing to support the pawn advance. Re-establishing the knight on a more active diagonal prepares a queenside advance. Repositioning the knight to b6 offers a dual threat, aiming to control the open c-file or potentially support a pawn push on the queenside. Repositioning the bishop to the open diagonal aims to challenge white's control of the central squares and prepare for pawn advances. Unlocking the file for the knight offers new avenues of attack against black's seemingly solid position. Gaining space on the king side for future pawn advances creates potential weaknesses in white's queenside defense. Activating the knight to pressure the weak squares and support the advancing pawns. Unblocking the c-pawn to prepare for eventual queen access to the file is the likely intent here. A daring check that forces the black king into a less secure central position, potentially opening lines for further penetration. Snatching that knight opens diagonals for the bishop and disrupts white's central pawn control. Grabbing the isolated pawn at b4 is a logical step, solidifying white's material advantage and aiming to simplify towards a winning endgame. Gaining material and simplifying into a favorable pawn advantage, this sacrifice seeks to exploit the misplaced king. The king's aggressive march, though seemingly bold, opens up black's pawn structure and potentially creates new targets on the king side. The king becomes the linchpin for black's remaining pawn structure, aiming to consolidate its forces. Centralizing the knight redirects the defense and prepares to support the pawn push, aiming for queenside expansion. Challenging the pawn chain directly opens lines, a bold decision in this endgame phase. Pawns are poised to dominate the center. The king feels the squeeze. Shifting the king to d4 opens diagonal lines, but exposes it to potential checks from the knight and bishop. Pivoting the king to the queenside aims to blockade the pawn advances and seize the vital square on b6. Pushing the pawn creates a potential passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's centralized king. The king marches forward to contest the central squares and restrict black's pawns. Opening the center creates a pathway for the king to escape the pressure, but it also exposes vulnerable pawns. Clearing the path for the white king to infiltrate the enemy position. Black prioritizes creating a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially force concessions. Gaining a touch more breathing room for the monarch is the immediate goal, preparing for potential king opposition. The king's advance now seizes central space, a bold gamble amid the pawn storm. Exploiting the king's exposed diagonal, this check forces black's hand, aiming to disrupt their pawn structure further. Seeking respite, the king attempts to escape the pawn's advance and white's knight threat. Snagging that pawn simplifies to an easily winnable rook and pawn endgame. Exploring the central pawn structure with the king offers a potential escape route from the encroaching knight. The knight's repositioning opens a path for the g-pawn and improves its defensive posture. Black captures the knight, finally simplifying into a pawn race where the king's exposed position on the dark squares becomes a significant liability. Exploiting the exposed black king, the knight aims to disrupt black's remaining coordination and initiate a decisive attack. Escaping into the queen's pawn weakness presents a fleeting sanctuary. The king must now navigate open lines and a relentless knight. Shifting the king to the center opens lines and prepares for pawn promotion. The king is becoming increasingly exposed as the pawn advances disrupt the defensive structure. Unlocking the king's pawn creates a decisive pass threat. Doubling down on pawn presence near the enemy king, aiming to complicate the endgame. Pushing the king forward is a bold attempt to create mating threats against the exposed black monarch. Grasping for space, black ventures forward with the pawn, hoping to create a breakthrough while the kings are still in relative proximity. The white king boldly steps into the fray, aiming to escort its pawns to glory and threaten the black king's sanctuary.